Inside President Jimmy Carter and wife Rosalynn Carter's 8-decade love story. Former President Jimmy Carter, who died at the age of 100 on December 29th, and Rosalynn Carter fell in love, raised a family, and spent most of their 77 years of marriage living in Plains, Georgia. When Eleanor Rosalynn Smith first laid eyes on Jimmy Carter, he was a fascinating older boy. She was a few days old and he was 3, and his mother was a nurse who helped deliver the infant girl in their hometown of Plains, Georgia. But still, it was the start of something big. The eventual sweethearts went on to have the longest marriage of any U.S. president and first lady in history, 77-plus years of matrimony that only ended when Rosalynn died November 19, 2023, at the age of 96. Jimmy died December 29th at the age of 100 at the home in Plains where he and Rosalynn spent most of their married life. In announcing his father's passing, son James E. Chip Carter III didn't give a cause, but the 39th President of the United States had been in hospice care since February 2023. "My father was a hero, not only to me but to everyone who believes in peace, human rights, and unselfish love," Chip said in a statement released by the Carter Center. "My brothers, sister, and I shared him with the rest of the world through these common beliefs. The world is our family because of the way he brought people together, and we thank you for honoring his memory by continuing to live these shared beliefs." His last public appearance was sitting in the front row at his wife's funeral. Rosalynn was laid to rest on their Plains property and, according to the Washington Post, Jimmy will be buried next to her under the shade of a willow tree by a pond he helped dig. Carter was the longest-living former U.S. president of all time, followed by George H.W. Bush, who died in 2018 at 94. The Carter Center shared in May 2023 that Rosalynn was battling dementia but continued to live happily with her husband, enjoying spring in Plains and visits with loved ones. After she died that November, a large memorial service was held for the great-grandmother of 14 in Atlanta, followed by a more intimate funeral at Maranatha Baptist Church, where Jimmy taught Sunday school. "I just think none of us really understand what it's like for him right now," grandson Jason Carter, the eldest of Jimmy and Rosalynn's 22 grandkids, told Southern Living in June. "We have to embrace that fact, that there's things about the spirit that you just can't understand." Ahead of his 100th birthday on October 1st, Jimmy remained emotionally engaged, Jason told People, and was still having experiences and laughing, loving. Minus the Carters' 4-year stay at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, their primary home was the one-story ranch house at 209 Woodland Drive that they built themselves in 1961. While the world ambassador for Habitat for Humanity and his missus knocked down a wall themselves during renovations in 2010, the 4-bedroom abode was modest by modern ex-president standards. "I don't blame other people for doing it," Carter told the Washington Post in 2018 of his fellow former commanders-in-chief who cashed in on lucrative business opportunities after leaving the White House. "It just never had been my ambition to be rich." And then he got up from the table to take his nightly after-dinner walk with the love of his life, hand in hand. Jimmy and Rosalynn, each the eldest of 4 siblings, grew up a few miles away from each other in Plains, Pop. 553 in 2021, he on a farm and she in a simple frame house in the middle of town. There was no movie theater, recreation center, or even a library, so school and church were the center of life for study and socializing. Rosalynn graduated from Plains High School as salutatorian while World War II was raging overseas, and, when she enrolled at Georgia Southwestern College in nearby Americus, there weren't many eligible young men around. "Our social life was bleak," she wrote in her 1984 autobiography First Lady from Plains, "our adolescent fantasies about love and romance high." But when she'd visit her longtime friend Ruth Carter, Rosalynn started to pay closer attention to a photograph on the wall of Ruth's older brother Jimmy, who was attending the U.S. Naval Academy at Annapolis. "I thought he was the most handsome young man I had ever seen," Rosalynn wrote. She'd known him for as long as I could remember, but their 3-year age gap meant they'd rarely crossed paths growing up, and he'd been away at school for 4 years. "I don't remember ever having said a word to him," she continued, "except when we bought ice cream cones from him one summer in the old bank building on the main street in town. He seemed so glamorous and out of reach." Ruth was all for playing matchmaker, but Rosalynn had worked herself into a frenzy, worried that the real thing wouldn't match the image in her mind. At a loss for what to say to Jimmy if they did meet, she recalled in her book B. In the summer of 1945, Right before Jimmy was supposed to go back to Annapolis, Ruth was determined to get those two together. She invited Rosalynn to a picnic at the Pond House, a local gathering spot built by Jimmy's father, James Earl Carter Sr., and that's where they were first together long enough to chat. Jimmy memorably teased Rosalynn about putting salad dressing instead of mayonnaise on her sandwich. The then 17-year-old didn't mind him poking fun at her, though, she wrote. And afterward, as they were cleaning up, I discovered I could actually talk to him. Still, Rosalynn didn't think Jimmy thought of her as anything other than his kid sister's friend. But later that day, she had just walked out of a youth group meeting at Plains United Methodist Church when Jimmy drove up and asked her to go on a double date to the movies with him, Ruth and her boyfriend. Rosalynn couldn't remember what they saw, she wrote in her book more than 35 years later, but the date couldn't have been more wonderful. Jimmy kissed her goodnight on the way home, the first time she'd ever let a guy sneak a smooch on the first date, and she was in love with a real person, not just a photograph. And vice versa. Carter famously told his mother, Bessie, Miss Lillian Carter, the very next morning that he was going to marry Rosalynn. I didn't know that for years, Rosalynn told the Post in 2018. She didn't know back in 1945, however, that Jimmy had a date with someone else the night after he went out with her, and then he was scheduled to catch a train back to Annapolis at midnight. So Rosalynn initially resisted Ruth's insistence that she join the Carter family at the train station to see Jimmy off. But she went. On the platform, Jimmy took Rosalynn aside, apologized and told her he would have much rather spent the evening with her. And he asked her to write. The other gal, Annelle Gray, married a medical student and moved to Macon, Jimmy noted in his 2015 memoir Jimmy Carter, A Full Life. The book's dedication to Rosalynn, who has kept my life full of love. Initially, Jimmy encouraged Rosalynn to go out and have fun, not to wait around for him, which just made her mad. So, she started writing to him about all the boys she was spending time with as friends, but admittedly distressed. Jimmy didn't need to know that, until, finally, he insisted they be exclusive, which is what she wanted all along. And yet, Carter recalled during a Habitat for Humanity press conference in 2019, when I asked Rosalynn to marry me for the first time, she said no. That was during his Christmas break in 1945, the first time he'd been home since their one date, and Rosalynn was too shocked to say yes. And, she admitted in First Lady from Plains, not yet confident enough for such an eligible bachelor. She had also promised her late father that she'd finish college. But during their second separation, she realized she totally wanted to marry Jimmy and accepted when he proposed again that February over President's Day weekend. He bought her a compact engraved with "I'll white G, I love you the goodest," beating instant messaging lingo by about 50 years. During their engagement, Jimmy sent Rosalynn a copy of the Navy Wives Handbook, and she read every word, excited to join him, basically anywhere but Plains. They married in a small ceremony at Plains Methodist Church on July 7, 1946, after both had graduated from their respective schools. They didn't send out invitations, but word got around that friends and family who wanted to attend were welcome. The bride was 18 and the groom 20, and pretty much everyone thought they were too young, Rosalynn recalled. But her mother, Frances, seemed happy that her daughter was so happy. The Carters spent their earliest days as husband and wife at the naval base in Norfolk, Virginia, where Jimmy was gone most of the week on assignments and Rosalynn enjoyed a crash course in homemaking. Their first child, son John William, Jack Carter, was born July 3, 1947, so the couple celebrated their first anniversary at the hospital as a family of 3. The following year, Jimmy was selected for submarine school in New London, Connecticut, and finally had regular hours so he could be home each night with his wife and child. They welcomed son Chip on April 12, 1950, while they were living in Hawaii. Then it was on to San Diego, California, then back to New London, where son Donnell Jeffrey, Jeff Carter, was born August 18, 1952, and then they moved to Schenectady, New York, so Jimmy could study nuclear power at Union College. Rosalynn has said that she planned on being a Navy wife, moving from city to city and seeing the world with her husband. Which she ultimately did, but not in the way she ever would have imagined. Jimmy was working toward a post on a nuclear submarine, but when his father died in 1953, he took leave and went back to Plains with his wife and sons to look after his family's peanut farm. Rosalynn hadn't intended